Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you about ancient travel. You think of ancient Greece, and you picture toga-clad philosophers having brilliant conversations, sun-drenched islands, and maybe a cozy taverna where travelers could rest their weary bones. But here's the thing. If you actually lived back then and had to journey from one city to another, the last place you wanted to find yourself at nightfall was checking into a Greek inn. And we're not talking about slightly inconvenient. We're talking about genuinely terrifying. These places were so bad, so genuinely awful, that merchants, soldiers, and anyone with the means to avoid them would literally sleep under stars, in their carts, or anywhere else before willingly entering through an inn's door. So before we get into why Greek inns were basically medieval horror shows waiting to happen, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, yeah? And drop a comment down below about the worst place you've ever had to sleep. I'm genuinely curious where you're tuning in from and what your tolerance is for absolutely filthy accommodations. Turn off your notifications if you haven't already, grab something to drink, and let's explore what made travelers absolutely terrified of spending a night in an ancient Greek inn. When you think about traveling in ancient Greece, you might imagine safe roads connecting bustling cities, with nice little rest stops along the way. A place where a weary traveler could lay their head, get a warm meal, and wake up refreshed for the next day's journey. That's the fantasy. The reality was dramatically, catastrophically different. Greek inns, called pandocheions, weren't hotels in any sense you'd recognize. They weren't even close. These establishments were the absolute bottom of the hospitality barrel, places where desperation met exploitation and hygiene went to absolutely die. A typical Greek inn was a narrow, dark building squeezed between other structures in a port city or along a main trade route. The exterior was usually made of mud brick or stone, weathered and stained from years of neglect. The windows, if they existed at all, were tiny openings that let in barely enough light or air to function. You'd push through a heavy wooden door, often hanging half-broken on its hinges, and immediately you'd be hit by a smell. Not a bad smell. A smell. The kind of smell that made seasoned soldiers gag and question their life choices. A combination of stale human sweat, spilled wine that had fermented into something toxic, rotting food, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and something else you couldn't quite identify. Spoiler alert, you probably didn't want to identify it. The interior was cramped, dim, and utterly chaotic. Most inns were single large rooms on the ground floor, sometimes with a small alcove in the back where the innkeeper slept, or rather, where the innkeeper made deals and took bribes. The room would be packed with wooden benches, rough tables stained with wine and food remnants, and scattered sleeping pallets that looked less like beds and more like straw piled on dirt with a thin cloth thrown over them. There was no real ventilation. Windows stayed sealed or covered most of the time to prevent thieves from reaching in. The result was an airless, fetid box that accumulated the stench of every human body, every spilled drink, and every bodily fluid that had ever been introduced into it. In winter, the door might stay shut completely, trapping everyone inside in a chamber of concentrated human misery. And we're talking about shared pallets here. Not individual beds, not even separated sleeping areas. Just communal platforms where anywhere from 5 to 20 people might sleep on a given night, pressed against each other, sharing whatever parasites, fleas, lice, and diseases happened to be traveling through that particular inn at that particular moment. Privacy? Forget about it. Dignity? left at the door. Basic human comfort. That was a luxury reserved for people with money, and if you had money, you absolutely would not be staying here. Now imagine you're a merchant who's been traveling for weeks. You've got sore feet, aching muscles, a pounding headache, and all you want is sleep. You ask the innkeeper, a grizzled man who looks like he hasn't bathed since the last Olympic Games, where you can lay down. He grunts and points to one of the communal sleeping areas. You pay your few coins, which he immediately pockets without offering anything resembling a receipt or guarantee of service. You're given a pillow, which is actually a piece of burlap stuffed with straw that's been used by probably 200 other travelers and hasn't been cleaned since, never. The pallet itself is damp, not fresh or cool damp. Grimy, cold, body heat saturated damp. It smells like a combination of old urine, mysterious discharge, and the general essence of human decay. You lie down. Your neighbors on either side include a snoring drunk, a guy with what sounds like advanced tuberculosis, and possibly a criminal or two. No one really asks questions at these places. If you brought a traveling bag with anything valuable in it, congratulations, it will be stolen while you sleep. Not might be. Will be. The innkeeper himself is in on it, or at least turns a blind eye for a cut of the profits. Ban. Dits and thieves actively hunted these places because they knew desperate travelers with money would eventually show up, and security was non-existent. You can't lock your door because there is no door to your sleeping area. You can't lock your belongings because there's nowhere safe to put them. You basically just have to hope that the particular night you're staying, the criminals aren't feeling particularly ambitious. Spoiler alert again. They usually are. The food situation was somehow even worse than the sleeping situation. If the inn provided food, which most did, you were in for a real treat. And by treat, I mean potential severe food poisoning. The innkeeper would usually prepare something vaguely stew-like, a murky combination of whatever was cheap, whatever was old, and whatever might still technically be considered meat or vegetable, before rotting completely. Vegetables would be overcooked to the point of becoming unidentifiable mush. Meat, if it existed at all, came from animals of questionable origin and dubious freshness. One traveler's account from the period describes inn food as looking like it had already been eaten and regurgitated by someone else. The water was from local sources, which in port cities meant salt water or water contaminated by who knows what. Most travelers wisely drank wine instead, which was often watered down and tasted like someone had whispered the word wine near water and called it close enough. If you were unlucky enough to eat the inn's food, you'd spend the next several days in intimate contact with a chamber pot, if an inn even provided one, which most didn't. People just used corners of the room, or didn't bother. Hygiene wasn't just poor, it was aggressively non-existent. The floors were packed dirt that had absorbed decades of spilled food, wine, and human waste. There was no attempt at cleaning. Occasionally, fresh straw would be scattered on top to cover the worst of the mess, but underneath it all was a layer of decomposing filth that had been accumulating since the inn opened. Toilets were either outdoors in a small courtyard if you were lucky, or you just relieved yourself somewhere on the grounds and hoped it would wash away eventually. Spoiler alert, it wouldn't. Running water existed nowhere in the inn. Washing your hands was theoretically possible if you brought your own water, which most traveling merchants did, but most inn guests just accepted that they'd spend the entire journey progressively filthier and disease-ridden. The innkeeper rarely washed anything, including himself. His hands, which prepared the food, touched money that other diseased travelers had touched, then went right back to preparing food. Cross-contamination wasn't just possible. It was guaranteed. Diseases spread through Greek inns like wildfire. Dysentery, typhoid, various intestinal parasites, all were standard residents of these establishments. Hepatitis A was practically a house specialty. Skin diseases were so common among people who slept in these places that travelers would develop mysterious rashes within days. Some probably came from fleas and lice that infested the bedding, others from the general filth and lack of opportunity to bathe. By the time you left the inn, you might have gained a disease or three that you'd carry for weeks or months, infecting other people you encountered along the way. This was basically how diseases spread across the ancient world. One infected person sleeps in an inn, gets better, or dies elsewhere, and the parasites and bacteria remain in the bedding, waiting for the next batch of travelers. The innkeeper himself was usually the worst part. These guys operated under absolutely no regulations whatsoever. They could charge whatever they wanted, serve whatever they wanted, and treat guests however they wanted. Many were essentially criminal organizations in human form. They'd overcharge outrageously, knowing people had no recourse. Need a room? That's triple the price because you look desperate. They'd water down wine to obscene levels, sometimes adding drugs that made you drowsy and vulnerable to theft. Some had explicit deals with bandits. A traveler would arrive with money, the innkeeper would tip off the bandits, and when the traveler woke up, everything would be gone. The traveler couldn't report it because the innkeeper was friends with the local guards. Corruption was the norm. Some accounts describe innkeepers slipping sleeping draughts into wine to rob travelers blind. Others describe inns where women faced serious assault because there were no private rooms, no locks, and no protection. You were a stranger in a strange place needing sleep, and the innkeeper owned the situation completely, and they exploited it, brutally and shamelessly. In ancient Greek literature, innkeepers were portrayed as thieves and criminals. Philosophers like Plato or Aristotle mentioned inns only in the context of human vice. There was a saying that if you wanted to understand evil, study an innkeeper. They were universally despised and associated with the bottom of human morality. Wealthy travelers avoided these places entirely, staying with friends, family, or other merchants instead. They'd camp in the open air or sleep in their carts. Anything was preferable. Poorer travelers had no choice. They stayed in inns and were constantly at risk of disease, theft, and assault. It created a brutal situation where the most vulnerable people were forced to accept the worst accommodations. You didn't stay in an inn because it was convenient. You stayed because you had no other option and were willing to risk your health, money, and possibly your life for a few hours of rest. Even that rest was interrupted by discomfort, noise, constant fear of robbery, and the reality that you were surrounded by disease and filth. The violence associated with Greek inns was a real problem that travelers had to account for in their planning. These weren't safe spaces. They were actually danger zones. Bandits didn't just rob people. They'd sometimes commit murder. The inns were so lawless that a traveler could be killed for their purse, their shoes, or just because someone was in a bad mood. Women traveling alone faced serious threats from other guests and from innkeepers themselves. Men traveling alone faced threats. Anyone traveling alone faced serious threats. There were no witnesses willing to testify because either the innkeeper was involved in the crime or the innkeeper would pay off anyone who tried to report it. The solution many travelers developed was to travel in groups or hire guards, which further increased the cost of travel. If you were a poor person, you just had to hope you lived through the night. If you were a merchant with valuable goods, you'd arrange to have people sleep in shifts watching your belongings. A lot of the traveling merchants became adept at hiding money and valuables in places that weren't obvious. They'd wear special belts with compartments. They'd hide coins in different locations on their body. They'd wrap valuable items in cloth and disguise them as worthless junk. Every traveler who stayed in an inn became an expert in the art of concealment because the alternative was losing everything and potentially being beaten or killed for your trouble. Some merchants would travel with fewer valuables on purpose, leaving most of their goods with people they trusted before entering an inn. This dramatically inefficient system meant that commerce in ancient Greece was slower and more expensive because people had to account for the reality of nightmarish inns and the necessity of protection against them. It's a system that basically punished travel and made commerce more difficult. Arguably, the quality of Greek inns was one of the factors that limited the expansion of trade in the ancient Mediterranean. If there had been safe, clean places to stay, more merchants would have traveled. More people would have ventured into unfamiliar territories. The economy could have grown faster. Instead, the reality of inns meant that long-distance travel was something you did only when absolutely necessary, only with significant preparation, and only with acceptance that you'd probably catch something unpleasant and might lose your belongings. Some travelers develop protective strategies that undermine the inn system. They'd stay awake all night with their belongings, too paranoid to sleep. They'd befriend other travelers for protection. They'd pay extra for rooms with locks if the innkeeper wasn't lying. Some would bribe staff for information about other guests. It was exhausting and required constant vigilance. Without regulation, travelers couldn't rely on anyone but themselves. They couldn't trust the innkeeper, other guests, or authorities. It was a lawless free-for-all where money and strength determined your fate. If you had money to bribe people and strength to defend yourself, you might survive with most of your stuff intact. If you didn't have either, you were probably going to have a really bad night. The medical risks were perhaps the most insidious danger of staying in an inn. You weren't just risking theft or violence. You were risking your long-term health. The diseases in these places were genuinely brutal. Parasitic infections would cause months of intestinal problems. Louse infestations would cause itching and skin problems that lasted for weeks after you left. Dysentery could be genuinely deadly, especially for people who were already weakened by travel. Travelers who went from being healthy to contracting something in an inn would spend weeks recovering, sometimes never fully recovering if the infection was severe. Some diseases you'd pick up from an inn would travel with you for the rest of your life. Hepatitis A could cause liver damage. Certain parasites would never fully leave your system. You could survive your stay in an inn and still be paying the physical price for it years later. This was accepted as part of long-distance travel. When you announced you were taking a trip, people understood that you might come back sick, possibly seriously sick. It was like accepting that you'd probably catch a modern pandemic before antibiotics existed. You knew it was a risk. You couldn't really avoid it if you had to travel. You just had to hope you didn't get hit too hard. Let's talk about what happened when things went really wrong in an inn. Because sometimes they did. Really, really wrong. Historical accounts document murders in inns, robberies that turned violent when travelers resisted, sexual assaults, in some cases organized criminal rings that would systematically rob and sometimes kill travelers. The inns were so outside the system of law and order that these crimes basically went unpunished. A traveler from another city couldn't do much if they were robbed. They could complain to the local authorities, but the authorities often were the criminals, or they were friends with the innkeeper. They could try to take the innkeeper to court, but the cost and effort would exceed the value of what they lost. They could seek revenge, but that often led to further violence and an escalating cycle of revenge. Most people just accepted their losses and moved on. They'd spread the word that the inn was dangerous, but that didn't stop desperate travelers from having to stay there. What else could they do? There was no alternative. The inn monopoly in most cities meant that if you needed rest, that particular inn was your only option. It's a genuinely brutal situation. Merchants who survived being robbed at an inn would often carry that trauma with them. Some would retire from long-distance travel entirely, finding local work instead. Others would become hypervigilant, suspicious of everyone, unable to sleep properly even in safer locations because of the paranoia they'd developed. The psychological impact of staying in a Greek inn wasn't just about the physical discomfort. It was about knowing that you were in genuine danger, that no one had your back, and that you were basically alone in a situation where you were prey. For women specifically, the risks took on an additional dimension that fundamentally affected their ability to participate in ancient commerce. A woman traveler staying in an inn was in a particularly vulnerable position. There were no private rooms. There was no security. The innkeeper had no incentive to protect her. Male guests saw her as an opportunity. In a lot of historical accounts, women travelers avoided inns completely if possible. They'd travel with male family members who could share their sleeping area and defend them if necessary. A woman traveling alone was so rare that it basically didn't happen in many parts of the ancient Mediterranean. The inns made it impossible for women to travel independently. If you were a woman who needed to travel, you had to either bring a male protector or not go at all. This meant that certain professions and opportunities were closed off to women because they couldn't safely navigate the travel that those opportunities would require. It's one of the hidden ways that Greek inns reinforced social inequality. They made independent travel impossible for women, which meant women couldn't access trades that required travel, couldn't pursue certain types of commerce, couldn't have the independence that male merchants could claim. The inns were a system of oppression disguised as simple commercial establishments. They weren't just bad places to sleep. They were actively limiting what people, particularly women, could do with their lives. There were a few alternatives to staying in an inn if you had the resources or connections. The wealthy could stay with friends, with family connections in the city, or with business associates. Merchants often had networks of other merchants in their trade who would provide lodging in exchange for hospitality when the situation was reversed. This created an informal but reliable system for wealthy travelers. Monasteries and temples sometimes provided shelter for travelers. The lodging wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe. You wouldn't get robbed. You wouldn't contract diseases from filthy bedding. You'd probably eat reasonably well. The downside was that you'd be expected to participate in religious services and behave with decorum. Some temples and monasteries refused shelter to certain travelers based on religious reasons or gender. But if you could access these places, they were infinitely better than an inn. Another option was to camp outside the city. You'd lose the protection of walls and guards, which came with its own dangers from bandits and wild animals. But at least you'd be in clean air. You'd have your own bedding that you controlled, and you wouldn't be exposed to the concentrated filth of an inn. Many travelers chose this option, especially if they had other people traveling with them for safety. Camping had its own risks, but at least they were different risks. You weren't constantly at risk of being robbed by the person providing your lodging. You weren't breathing in air fouled by decades of human waste. You weren't sleeping pressed against strangers with unknown diseases. For merchants with goods, camping also meant better protection of inventory. You could arrange guards around your camp more easily than you could police an inn where the innkeeper was probably working against you. Wealthy travelers brought their own lodging, traveling with tents or portable structures. This was expensive, obviously. You needed people to carry equipment and manage setup. But if you had money, it was the best option. You carried a clean inn with you, and no one could rob it because your people would guard it. This created economic division. The wealthy opted out of the inn system entirely, staying in temples with friends or in their own lodging. The poor had to stay in inns. The middle class could camp or stay with associates. The poorest travelers were most exploited, paying more for worse conditions. It's a system that punished poverty and rewarded wealth brutally. The regulations, or complete lack thereof, created a situation where inequality just kept getting worse. Because there was no oversight, because customers had no recourse, because innkeepers faced no consequences for their behavior. There was no incentive to improve. Why would an innkeeper invest money in cleaning if they could just pocket that money and let the place decay? Why would they provide better food if people had nowhere else to go? Why would they protect travelers from thieves if they could profit from cooperating with the thieves? The system of incentives was completely broken. It actually encouraged the worst possible behavior. An innkeeper who was honest and provided decent conditions was at a disadvantage compared to an innkeeper who lied, cheated, overcharged, and cooperated with criminals. The criminal innkeeper would make more money. The honest innkeeper would struggle. This meant that over time, the inns got progressively worse as the criminal innkeepers drove out the honest ones. It's a depressing example of how a lack of regulation and accountability can lead to a system that systematically rewards the worst behavior and punishes anything approaching decency. By the later period of ancient Greece, most inns were probably awful. A few might have been slightly less awful than others, but none of them were good. This is what happens when commerce operates in a total vacuum of rules and enforcement. It becomes a race to the bottom where the worst actors set the standard for everyone else. Merchants adapted. Travelers planned routes to avoid needing inns. And the system persisted, broken and brutal, for centuries. By the time traveling scholars in Greece wrote accounts of their journeys, complaining about inns was basically a standard part of any travel narrative. Everyone had a horror story. An innkeeper who stole from them, a night they spent fighting off vermin, a meal that made them violently ill, a discovery that they'd been overcharged egregiously, a threat or attack they'd experienced. These weren't rare events. They were expected outcomes of staying in an inn. A traveler who made it through a stay without something going wrong was considered lucky. This was seen as just part of the nature of travel. It's the same way people in the medieval period expected to get sick if they traveled, or the way explorers in the age of exploration expected dysentery and death. It was a known risk that you accepted when you decided to travel. The best you could hope for was that nothing catastrophic happened, that you didn't lose too much money, and that whatever disease you contracted wasn't severe enough to kill you or leave you permanently damaged. It's genuinely hard to overstate how much inns shaped ancient Greek attitudes toward travel. They made travel dangerous, expensive, and psychologically taxing. They limited who could travel and how often they could do it. They enriched a class of innkeepers through exploitation and crime. They made commerce slower and more costly because merchants had to account for lost goods and expenses related to staying in these places. In a weird way, The horrible inns of ancient Greece might have been one of the things that limited the expansion of Greek civilization. If there had been a reliable chain of safe, clean inns where merchants could trust their belongings and their safety, more trade could have flourished. More people would have been willing to travel. The economy could have grown larger and faster. Instead, the broken inn system kept the Greek world more fragmented and more limited than it might otherwise have been. It's one of those hidden structural problems in the ancient world that you don't think about until you actually learn how bad things were. The inns weren't just bad places to sleep. They were fundamentally limiting the potential of an entire civilization by making travel so unpleasant and dangerous that people did it as little as possible.